is even lower, and the number of companies verifying the data is even lower. So I think that what that says is people are willing to report some basic information and make assessments, but there's still a question about what they're doing with that information. And I've been talking to a number of asset managers out there who are looking and advocates for further climate change disclosure. And they are happy to see that people are giving more information. They're saying, give us the information. We want to be able to assess the risk for ourselves. But we don't just want the information. We don't want boilerplate. Now, I'll give you some more data points right there with respect to specific industries. They want engagement at the C-level and at the board level. They want companies to assess, evaluate, manage, and eventually mitigate their climate change exposure and risk. What they're saying is, we see this out there, and we want an understanding of what's going on in our portfolios as something that we've flagged and identified as an important risk. So finally, after years of calling on the SEC finally comes out and says they're going to publish something and make commentary about it. And the background on this is that what the SEC said was that the SEC's existing disclosure framework already applies to climate change. So that was a little bit of a letdown for some advocates who wanted very specific disclosure information. They wanted the SEC to say, I want to know A, B, and C about climate change from every company that's submitting something. But what the SEC did do is it put the world of public companies on notice that investors consider climate change information to be material, that a reasonable investor would consider climate change information to be important in deciding how to vote or make an investment decision. So they made some very specific commentary about what this means. They said climate change matters could have a significant effect on operating and financial decisions. What that means at the company level is you can no longer say that you didn't know you should have been looking into it. You didn't know that this needed to be on management's agenda. You can't say that this is an ops level issue. This is an investor issue. And that's one of the takeaways, I think, for a lot of people in the service side who are helping companies engage their way through this, is to think about how you can reach out to companies. And I think you're going to see more engagement at the higher levels of management. And that's going to get you more focus. And frankly, that's what investors want. They want to see engagement on the topic. They don't want to see people just punching out some numbers and responding with boilerplate. So the SEC started flagging some of the items that companies should be thinking about. They should be assessing the impact of legislation and regulation on their CapEx, on whether they have to buy or sell allowances. So they noted that you can't say positive things. If you think your business is going to be able to benefit from these matters, you should be talking about it too. Frankly, if your competitor is benefiting from it and you're not, that's a risk to you too that you need to be assessing. That they called an indirect consequence. If your suppliers are subject to factors, you need to be thinking about it. If you have international operations, you need to be thinking about it. If you have international suppliers, you need to be understanding what it means. Should you be changing one of your material inputs because it has a high carbon profile and you buy it from Europe? You need to be wondering whether that's going to change the inputs for your products, your pricing, your sourcing. And you're going to go beyond that to think about physical impacts of climate change. I recommend reading the release. You probably don't read a lot of SEC releases, and you really probably shouldn't read a lot of SEC releases. But this one's short. It's 30 pages, double-spaced, and a couple of those pages are just introductions. It's really about a dozen pages. But the reason I recommend it is because I think it'll be an eye-opener. It explains in detail what the SEC means when they talk about materiality. And then the SEC goes on to talk in detail about climate change. So I think if you look at some of the things they're saying and you understand what's going on there, you're hearing the SEC reiterate what they're hearing from investors. And that's why it matters. The SEC doesn't really care from their perspective as a policy matter what companies are doing in their businesses at the operational level. What they care is that the marketplace functions in a way where information flows. And what they've gotten is loud complaints from lots of money under management that they feel companies are not providing information and therefore they can't make assessments about their long-term risk profiles in their portfolios. So that's why I recommend reading it, because you're getting in touch with what you think investors are calling for out there. And investors are calling for disclosure for a different reason. What investors want is, one, to be able to assess the risk, but two, they think it will mandate that companies pay attention to what investors think is important. So in other words, I don't think any company is going to respond if the SEC required companies to disclose whether management or the board is considering and weighing climate change risk. I don't think there are many companies that are going to say, we are not looking at it. They're going to engage, and that's what investors want. They just want an assessment to help companies look and help decide whether they need to be taking action to mitigate a risk that's been flagged in the marketplace by investors as important. What's covered? What's covered is a broad array of topics, everything from your business description to legal proceedings that might be impacted to your discussion analysis of your financial results to related risk factors, how it impacts everything from CapEx to your competitive position. But the real goal is to help investors see through the eyes of management, to help them understand the company's prospects in this very confusing landscape of what's coming down the pike on not only the regulatory front, but the consumer front and the physical impacts of climate change front. And companies and investors don't want their companies to be caught flat-footed. So the SEC provided a long list of examples for companies to consider. So again, one of the things the SEC was doing was issuing a wake-up call of things you got to think about. First one's the easiest to understand. Are you going to have to purchase allowances under cap and trade? And what's that going to mean for your business? Now that's maybe not going to happen anytime soon in the United States, but it's happening in other regimes around the world, and that can impact you. Certainly easy to understand. But you're also going to have to talk, they gave an example talking about costs to improve your facilities and your equipment to reduce emissions. That's coming into play no matter what. That's already happening at the EPA, and we've already seen a long line of that. You can already see it in fuel economy standards for cars. You maybe never fit that into the climate change concept, but now it's riding along that as well. And when your providers, suppliers are related to that business, you got to look at it. You've got to look at whether weather disruptions are going to be issues. Physical effects on the coastline range. The example they gave is not only people who have property on the coastline, but banks who were exposed to lots of lending on coastline property. So they just want you to think beyond the first level of just saying, we see it, we understand it, but we don't really, are not going to pay attention to it. Now, the SEC didn't provide and hit on or mandate very specific disclosure that some investors were calling for. Some investors wanted specific GHG emission disclosure. Some investors called for specific scenario analysis. What are we going to look like if carbon's priced at $20 a ton? What are we going to look like if carbon's priced at $40 a ton? They didn't call for that. They didn't make a call for an affirmative statement as to whether the board has been engaged on climate risk. I think that's okay. I think things at the SEC are incremental, and it's very political over there. You know, the commissioners only acted on this by a vote of 3-2, and it was along party lines. And one of the dissenting commissioners said that because she was not a scientist, she could not comment appropriately on the validity of climate change. Now, hopefully, that, regardless of your politics, is going to become a more and more minority position. But the fact that it was discussed at the SEC as to whether this should be a matter shows you that there's still going to be incremental steps, and it's going to take time. And I think that's natural. The SEC moved in the same way with respect to disclosure about environmental matters from the late 60s until the early 80s. They also first issued, when it came to environmental matters, an interpretive release, just like they have here. It was even gentler than the climate change release. So, and then they had 10 years of litigation, hearings, calls from Congress. But eventually a consensus built, and then the SEC came out with even stronger guidelines, and that's the framework that we're operating in now. And I think that if you look ahead X number of years, you're going to see the same thing happening at the SEC. There's a lot going on at the state and the federal level, and I'm not going to cover it in any kind of detail. But what I really want to get to on this point is that the absence of cap and trade at the federal level is not changing the need for companies to go inward and look at their climate change exposure. Because there's EPA regulation, we'll take as an example. EPA has already determined or made effective as of January 1, 2010, reporting requirements for heavy emitters of greenhouse gases. They have, due to become effective in January 2011, the ability to regulate those emitters, to require that they file for permits and they demonstrate the use of best available control technologies to suppress their emissions. So that right there is a change in the profile for those companies. There's talk about that being delayed by a couple of years. In fact, there's a movement afoot in the Senate right now to attach a rider to the Department of Defense appropriations bill for this year to delay that by 2 years. I don't know if it'll happen, but even that is you know, just pushing it out to some extent. At the federal level, on the statutory level, there's, you know, a lot of bills and proposals out there that folks have seen. But I flag it not because we don't know which ones will pass or what the current status is, but just to recognize that they cover a lot more than greenhouse gas emissions. They go to renewable electricity or energy standards. By the way, renewable electricity standard is back on the agenda for this year, and there's a push to try to make that happen. It also reaches all the way to fuel standards and other standards. And then there's the state level in the United States. There's numerous states that have set greenhouse gas emission targets. You take an example of California with AB 32, and that's also, as I said, under attack. But that also shows you that it's not just capping trade. There's a lot of different things happening in the matrix, and so companies have to pay attention to how those relate to their business. I'll leave you with just a couple predictions to understand what you might see out there and how you might be able to help companies as you see what they're facing as challenges. I do